Welcome to Alamein to Zem Zem, Keith Douglas's powerful account of his experiences in World War II. This book isn't just about battles, it's a deeply personal story of what it's like to live and fight in a world torn apart by war. With vivid descriptions and honest reflections, Douglas takes us from the Battle of Alamein across North Africa, sharing moments of chaos, courage, and humanity. This is more than a war memoir, it's a journey into the heart of what it means to be a soldier. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider subscribing. These are his words. Let's begin. The next morning, we went back to the regiment with orders for a move at 8 o'clock to take Mersa Matruh. A squadron was strung across the road, my troop combing between the road and the sea. As we approached an Italian position, 5 men came out holding up their hands, with packets of cigarettes in them. One pointed also to his watch, as an inducement to us to take them. This was very different from the German method of surrendering. They climbed onto the tank, and we moved on. But the main advance had left us behind, and when we broke a track crossing a little ditch, we were stranded out of sight of everyone. The tank was stuck in the ditch, and before we could mend the track, we would have to be towed off it. By now, it was about 9:30, and I set out with one of the crew to walk to the road, the other 2 members, this was a 4-man tank, staying with the 5 prisoners. Luckily, we had plenty of rations. As we walked, we built stone cairns on every ridge we crossed, and after about an hour's walking, reached the road, which here curved away inland, crossing the railway. We passed an abandoned lorry or 2, but found no loot in them. The idea of loot was uppermost in everyone's mind now, and what made us most impatient to catch up with the regiment was the thought that the others would get to the loot first. An Arab, the first of many, was already poking about in the back of one of the lorries, and said to us as we passed, "Saida. Into Inglesi?" And when we affirmed this, answered transparently, "Inglesi quoi? Olamoni mush quoi? Shwoy biskiet? Sucre? Zigara?" We gave him a pack of Italian cigarettes, saying to each other, "The old bastard. If we'd been Germans, it'd have been Olamoni qua, Inglesi mush qua." At the side of the road, we waited all day by a stranded crusader of another regiment. The crew of this tank had a Luger pistol each, and a new type of pistol none of us had seen before. There was plenty of ammunition, and we began potting at petrol tins, which entertained us most of the afternoon. This crew kindly made us some tea and gave us lunch. We picked up some Italian mess tins and cutlery to eat with from the roadside. Already a procession of lorries, nose to tail, some of them bearing the Cairo area sign, and all of them patently from base units, their drivers and crews goggling at everything they passed, were tearing down the road towards Mersa with supplies of every kind. There were Air Force ground crews moving up to take over aerodromes. At times, the traffic was 4 abreast as well as nose to tail, and it thickened hourly. A continuous line of abandoned Axis vehicles and tanks, some burnt out but many of them intact, stretched along both sides of the road. Ammunition of all kinds lay about. Hopeful drivers and crews of passing vehicles sometimes got out to poke among the wreckage, but they were too late, nothing had been left for them. One of them was thrilled to find a dead man wrapped in a blanket and submerged in a puddle. During the day, hundreds of Axis soldiers came walking eastwards in dejected little groups, not looking at the mass of vehicles bucketing along towards the west, which at times came near to running them over. Sometimes the Italians begged for food, but the Germans went by like sleepwalkers. The few vehicles which tried to beat their way back towards Alexandria were forced off into the sand by the uncompromising stream of supply. The new type of pistol had jammed, the moving parts had somehow seized up, and we could not make out how to strip it, so I called to 4 German soldiers who were walking past. They all lifted their heads in apprehension, ready to endure something more. A corporal walked across to them, holding the revolver. He could not make them understand what he wanted. When I crossed over and spoke to them in halting German, they smiled in huge relief, only to tell us how to strip the pistol. They had it in bits in a moment but advised us to prefer the old type of Luger, which was much more reliable. I asked their spokesman, a corporal with 2 medal ribbons, if they had had anything to eat. He said yes, they had chocolate, and offered us some. They all had 10 or more of the round packets of plain chocolate whose empty cartons we had seen so often. We exchanged some tins of bully beef for some of the chocolate and stood about munching chocolate while the Germans opened the bully and passed it around. A general conversation began. The corporal pointed to the crusader and inquired, "Der Panzer ist kaputt?" We explained vaguely what was wrong with it. We argued over the relative merits of some Spitfires which roared low over us, and the Me-110. Photographs were produced. The corporal had been in France, in Paris, postcards from Paris, in Greece, pictures of the Parthenon. In Russia? No. And how long in Africa? Via Monita. They were a Mark III tank crew. "Vili," said the corporal, had only been here 16 days. Would it matter that he hadn't been issued with a pay book yet? Germans set a great store by their pay books. Page 4 records all the essential details of their existence. If they lose page 4, they feel they have lost their hold on life. Willy had big ears and looked very like Dopey, the seventh and youngest dwarf. The matter of the loss of his pay book had evidently been preying on his mind. I suppose he had been told what an unpardonable crime it was to be found without a pay book, as our recruits are. Poor little toad. So the drizzling afternoon passed, in talk. The corporal had been at Köln University and had taken part in sports against Cambridge before the war. He said he did not believe in the stories of German atrocities in Poland and Russia, and I do not think he did believe them. Why should he have known anything about them? The whole theory of the German system seems to be that they concentrate their thugs and perverts, and use them apart from their decent fighting men. We heard later from prisoners who had been in Russia how the SS battalions came up to take over the ground won by the fighting troops, and to deal with the civilian population. It began raining again, and we all sheltered in an old Italian lorry and drank tea. About 5 o'clock, an officious staff major in a jeep arrived and ordered the prisoners to be on their way. Presumably, he thought we were lowering our morale. Strict orders against fraternizing with prisoners were soon published. "They will only despise you," said the order. I wonder. At least I got enough material from that conversation for a lecture when the regiment became static again and needed such things to occupy its time. These men seemed to be sure that the campaign in Africa was nearly over, as it should have been, after such a victory, and Rusland Osh, said one of them, bringt sich am Ende. But they all said, as the prisoners in Tunisia told us, that in Europe, we should have our work cut out. The mechanist sergeant of the regiment who owned the roadside Crusader arrived soon after the prisoners had gone. He had seen fit to grow a beard, which none of Piccadilly Jim's men would have dared do, and was unnecessarily dirty. When I asked him if he could give us any help, he addressed me offensively as my friend, with an evil accent, and refused to do anything for us. As I wore no badges of rank, I could not object to his treating me as he would have treated any other rank, but did not see what right he had to take this tone with anyone, and said so. At the end, towards dark, we persuaded a kindly corporal of the 3rd Regiment in the brigade to follow our line of cans across and tow us out. But it grew dark on the way, and we could no longer see the cans, so we passed a very cold night. We had started optimistically in the morning with thin shirts in sunshine, without blankets, rolled in canvas tarpaulins on inexorably stony ground. In the morning we located the tank, to my relief, as the corporal had begun to be a little skeptical of its existence and had suddenly demanded my identity card when we began to lose the cans. The Italians had apparently been entertaining as well as useful. They were not fighting troops, but the equivalent of an Ensa concert party, and one of them was a padre. They were all very young, and one of them, before the war an opera tenor in Milan, had beguiled the night with what my driver and operator considered real high-class music. They washed up after breakfast and mended our track with great cheerfulness. We gave them a ride to the road and saw them onto a lorry heading east. We spent another night on the road and ate a huge supper, having drawn 3 days' rations for 2 fictitious stranded tanks from a divisional issue depot, where I swapped a Beretta for a bottle of brandy. In the morning, we caught up with the regiment resting the other side of Mersa and heard the story of the capture of Mersa, beginning with that of a staff officer going in there in a staff car before the enemy had cleared out and getting put in the bag. The colonel's tank had been knocked out on the way in. Piccadilly Jim had escaped by the skin of his teeth, but his driver and gunner were killed. For the moment, we were not continuing the advance. Everyone remembered Piccadilly Jim's speech before the battle about leaving the other buggers to do the chasing, and fantastic rumors, called blue lights, began to circulate, the usual one about going home included. A squadron set up an officer's mess in the back of a 3-ton lorry and lived on loot. Wine, cigars, cocoa, cherries, chocolate, meat roll, and excellent ersatz coffee graced our menu. A great deal of fine white flour went with it, and cherry tarts were on the table for 4 meals a day. Tom and I and Ken Tinker made an expedition in the neighborhood and returned with a luxurious black tent, like a sheikh's, for each squadron. Ours had talc windows and even an asbestos flap for leading a hot pipe in. Candles were among the spoil, the tent blacked out completely, and we began to spend convivial evenings. I took a jeep down to the harbor at Mersa as soon as possible to see if the motor torpedo boats were in. Some 2 or 3 were there, but not the one we wanted. She was expected in any time, said a rating, and as we stood there, she came gliding in with an inward rumble of deep engines and berthed. I saw Norman, browner and more ridiculously muscular than ever, in dirty shorts and old split gym shoes, shirtless and hatless, emerge on deck. As soon as she was berthed, we went aboard. Alec, whom I had last seen just before the ill-fated raid on Tobruk, came out of the poky cabin grinning all over his ugly face, and I introduced Ken Tinker. We all went below and told our news over cigars and orange gin, which they had brought up with them from Alexandria. Norman wore round his neck a charm I recognized as Milena's. When I saw it, all the pleasant color of the situation faded, and for a moment I remembered Mila as I had seen her, looking beautiful and clearly bored by my questions, whispering, "Don't make a scene, please, Keith. People are looking at us." But the atmosphere of bonhomie, gin, and cigars soon changed the mechanical smile on my face into a real one again. Ken and I drove away in the Jeep and rushed to get back in time for tea. We found Tom very indignant. He had been down to Mersa on a looting expedition with Andrew, had found a lot more cocoa and cherries, and a cask of wine. Andrew had suddenly and inexplicably taken charge of everything, forbidden Tom, nay, ordered him, as major to lieutenant, to leave the wine behind, and to hand over to him all the other food so that he could see that it was fairly distributed. At tea, Andrew's temper was uncertain, and the next morning he announced that we ought to break up the mess, as he had distributed the goods to the tanks, and we should not get any in the mess. "But why didn't you set aside some for the mess?" said Edward. "You knew we were living in a mess, didn't you?" "Yes, but you can't go taking it all for the officers," said Andrew. "Have you distributed it to tanks?" asked Tom. "Of course." "Well, my crew haven't had any," said Tom. "Nor have mine," I said. "I don't think mine have, Andrew," said Edward. Andrew waved a hand vaguely. "It was there," he said. "They probably didn't bother to come and get it." "Well, did you tell them it was there?" asked Tom. "They were told," said Andrew loftily. We could not understand why or how this situation had arisen. It took us by surprise. No one was sure what to say to Andrew. We were probably relieved when, next morning, he announced that, since we were, unreasonably, his tone suggested, determined to live in a mess, he was going to live on his tank. And he went. In order to slacken the tension, Andrew was, a week or so later, transferred to B Squadron, and we began to live in harmony again. 10. When I found out the division had parked themselves just behind us, remembering my defection, I prepared for a deal of bother. But they made less trouble than I had feared. Their first shot was fired after we had been there 2 or 3 days. The Colonel Administration, Quartering, and General Staff, a Welshman, whose appearance upheld the theories of the British Israelites, sent a note to Piccadilly Jim, saying, "Could you persuade Keith Douglas to pay this mess bill, as all attempts have failed?" This was more subtlety than I would have expected from them. The mess bill enclosed was made out up to the date of my departure from division and had, of course, not been presented to me. Now, to send any kind of note to a regimental colonel alleging that one of his officers has not paid a mess bill is a fairly serious charge against the officer, letting the regiment down, conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman, and other obsolescent phrases float in the air. I was sent for peremptorily by the adjutant and protested my innocence. "You'd better go down and straighten it out with Rennie," said Morris. Rennie was the president of the mess committee of the divisional messes, a genial, hearty soul whom no one trusted an inch. I took the squadron jeep and drove back into the divisional area, as one who drives into another century. The atmosphere there was quite unaffected by the battle. Immaculate Corps of Military Police saluted and directed me, and I found Rennie in his own mess, in the act of drawing off a glass of wine from a huge barrel. "Hello, old boy," he said, beaming. "Have a glass of this. We managed to get a detachment of the Corps of Military Police to guard all the enemy foodstuffs and whatnot, so we're well supplied." This I knew already. Tom and I had been sternly warned off a dump of food by the Corps of Military Police, who was supposed to be preventing looting. I accepted a cup of wine gracefully. "I came up about a mess bill," I said. "There seems to be some trouble. So I thought I'd come up and pay it." Colonel Rickard wrote a note to Piccadilly Jim saying all efforts to make me pay it had failed. "Actually, this is the first time it's been sent in." "Oh well, there's no hurry, old boy," Rennie replied easily. "I told Yates to give it to you, but I expect he didn't have a chance." Difficult to remember that this was the officer who had arranged for me to be sent to Divisional B Echelon at the beginning of the battle. "I expect you've had quite an exciting time, haven't you?" "Yes, I suppose I have." "Has anyone here noticed my disappearance yet?" I asked. "I should keep out of the G.1's way for a bit. I think Tim Thorpe wanted to see you, or Jim Audit, about your trucks. I'll go along now, shall I?" "Yes, you'll probably find him in now, A.C.V.6. Thank you for the wine. So long." I saw Tim about the truck, and he asked me the details of my escape. He said the G.1 was in a fury and sending circular notices to all the departments of the division to know why I had been allowed to go without his being informed and where I had gone. I paid my mess bill, and finding the divisional mess as well stocked as if it was still in the Cairo area, bought a bottle of rye and a lot of chocolate and spam, and returned to dinner in triumph. Piccadilly Jim undertook to negotiate with the G.1, and I was allowed to remain with the regiment on condition that I went down to division again and apologized personally to the G.1 for running away. This was probably going to be embarrassing, but anything was worthwhile in return for my cunge. I went down that evening in the Jeep. There was only a duty clerk in the ACV. The G.1 was in the mess. I went over to the lighted mess tent and ducked my way into its august company. The General, the G.1, and the G.2, and the Ack and Quack Colonel were playing bridge. I said, "Good evening," tentatively. The General grunted, either at his cards or at me, and silence fell again. Presently, an exquisite young captain in a tailor-made Barathia battle dress offered me a drink. I accepted. The poker sitting seemed to be good for hours yet. I had another drink and discussed some sort of shop with the captain. I did not know what he was, but like everyone at division he had all the latest news about everything. We were already hundreds of miles behind the fighting line. Tobruk had fallen, and the armored cars were pushing on to Benghazi. We were out of it, probably going back to the Delta, he said. Presently, the poker players got up to stretch their legs, and the G.1 said to me, rather awkwardly, "Just step outside a moment with me." He checked the old boy, which from long habit was rising to his lips, and said, "Will you please?" Instead. Outside, he puffed at his pipe and regarded the stars. We strode up and down in silence. At last, he said, "This business of your running away. Why did you do it?" He seemed hurt. I tried to think of some explanation that he could understand, but finally said weakly that I did not know, and that I did not think I was much use in B echelon, driving a 2-tonner. "That's absurd, of course," he said. "I never gave any such orders. If you'd asked me, I would have given you permission to go back while the battle was on, willingly." "Oh, would you? Then why refuse my application when I did ask you?" Aloud, I said, "Well, I'm very sorry, sir." "Well," said the colonel with a note of relief at having got this awkward business of ticking me off over and done with, "don't be unmilitary again." He permitted himself an old boy. "You seem to be doing well with your regiment, you'd better stay there." I was itching to get away, but he added, in the voice of one doing a duty of politeness, burying the hatchet, etc., "Come in and have a drink." So I had to go in again, and everyone except the General spoke kindly to me, though he spoke over my head and across me, and broke in upon the conversation as though I were invisible and inaudible. I bade him good night as soon as possible, saluted, and managed to get out of the hut without knocking my cap off. As though to round off this incident of battle, I was sent back to Alexandria in a 1500 the next day to have my eyes tested, for I had lost one pair of my glasses and badly cracked another during the battle. I was given £50 of regimental money and a shopping list like a quartermaster's inventory. We started early in the morning, driver, sergeant, and myself, and began badly by skidding into a 3-ton truck on the wet road. But we escaped damage, and as the sun climbed, the surface of the road dried off. We retraced the steps of the infantry's coastal advance, a long trail of derelicts and scattered debris, ammunition, clothing, and equipment, until we bumped round and over the last cluster of shell holes and began to eat the last miles to Alexandria. Presently, we passed the palm trees and the police post by Burg el Arab, and forked left into the outskirts of Alexandria, as I had done so many times before the attack. We were held up by the tea house and the little bridge at Scott's Corner, by a long column of prisoners marching, and then entered the stinking street of the abattoirs, crossed the great bridge, and began to follow the clanging, slug-like course of the trams between walls too high and close together to permit our passing them. The usual cluster of Arabs clung to the back of the tram ahead, grinning all over their filthy faces and alternating the V sign with gestures begging cigarettes. An innocent stranger might have thought they were blowing us kisses. The men and women on the sidewalks, mostly the poorest of the Greeks who form a great part of the city's population, smiled and cried out to us, seeing our faces, clothes, and vehicles covered with dust, and a shrapnel hole or two in the side. Heading for Muhammad Ali Square in the center of the city, I was still debating whether to swallow my pride and go to see Milena, or to put up at a hotel, or even to sleep in the truck, which at the time seemed the most natural of the three. We drove along the Corniche, past bathers and sunbathers, a blaze of colored costumes as bright as a garden. At Stanley Bay, troops on leave and the huge, indolent population of smart women hid the sand and dotted the blue half-circle of sea. Turning off the main road to Mustafa Barracks, and parking the truck and its driver in the transit camp there, my mind was still not made up. But while I cogitated and debated, and talked to Sergeant Norman on the pavement outside Mustafa, about accommodating ourselves, my feet were subtly leading us toward Milena's house in Rushdie Pasha, and I let them take us there and went in to see who was at home. It was strange to find how easy it was for me to cross the little strip of garden and open the old door with its peeling paint, without the thought much disturbing me of all the times I had gone there before with an evening of dancing and moonlit strolling before me. The effect of battle had been admirably cathartic. But the odd face, with its delicate bones and nobility of line, the twisted smile and curious, sad, dishonest eyes, and her sinuous, clearly made body, like a drawing made with an airbrush, her absurd accent, all beat my fortitude down when she confronted me. Committed now, I took refuge in a flood of my own conversation, telling them all my news, showing them some of the booty, the Luger and Beretta revolvers, and the German trousers. They made beds for us in the room above. Her mother and father asked me a question or two, the old man, shriveled and with quick bright eyes, like a lizard, even to the lizard's air of ancient aristocracy, spoke appalling English, her mother, fat, with the blousy remains of beauty, speaking bad French comfortably. The wretched little puppy we had rescued from the street, and had spent weeks in delousing and feeding up, had died while I was away. In the evening, Milena, Sergeant Norman, and I went to see some film, I forget what it was. Sergeant Norman and I slept on the floor in the drawing room. In the morning, we began shopping in earnest and bought a great number of tin mugs, Monsieur Pegner taking a day off from his office to come round the bazaars with me and see that I was not swindled. I bought 6 little pewter medicine glasses for drinking whiskey. Coming back from the bazaar, I saw a pathetically thin girl in a knitted woolen dress. When we came nearer, I was shocked to recognize Titsa. I greeted her, and she smiled, not with her usual luminous gaiety, but with an effort. Monsieur Pegner, when I looked round to introduce him, said something about having business at the office and, with a flourish of his hat, tactfully left us. I turned round again to Titsa. She had on a knitted woolen dress, made of an appalling green and grey, in loose, stretchy wool quite unsuitable for any kind of garment designed to fit closely. It had stretched and hung on her, making her look thinner and paler than ever. I asked how she was, and why so thin. She had mal à l'estomac. Her mother had been forcing the family to fast again, although their priest had given them a wartime absolution. I steered her into a cafe and made her take some cakes and coffee. She still refused a meal, and seemed more than usually afraid of being seen out with me by one of her cousins or acquaintances. She reiterated her phrase, "Il y a du monde." She was not much interested in anything I said, but asked me to take her out in the evening, when she could arrange some sort of alibi for being out of the house. We said goodbye at Rumley station, since she would not go nearer her home with me, and I picked up Sergeant Norman and took the truck down to the docks to see Milena, who was working for Sarconi and Speed, selling drinks and tobacco wholesale to ships. We drove the truck into the docks and arranged to fill the spaces under seats, etc., with orange gin, liqueurs, cigarettes, and cigars. Sitting on these, we drove out past the sentry and the Egyptian police, congratulating ourselves on getting English gin for 7 shillings a bottle, and defrauding the Egyptians who had lived upon us so long. In the afternoon, we bought some 2,000 eggs from the Nile Cold Storage Company, and a lot of tinned food. The Navy, Army, and Air Force Institutes, NAAFI, refused to serve us, because we did not live in Alexandria. We finished the day's shopping by ordering 3,000 petite pains to be ready, newly baked, at 9 o'clock the next morning. In the evening, Titsa and I spent a dismal time, drinking lemonade in the dark at a cafe on the Corniche, with the sea growling and stinking like a wildcat 100 yards away. She went home early, and I met Milena and took her to another film. We went home in a taxi, twined sleepily in each other's arms, as we had often done before, but even in this proximity it was as though there were a sheet of metal between us. In the morning, we started back after the counting and loading of 3,000 beautiful, scented new loaves in sacks. On the way back, we stopped at the bulk Navy, Army, and Air Force Institutes at Burg El Arab, which we reached about 5 minutes after their closing time. A dirty Royal Army Service Corps corporal, who was in charge of it, refused to sell us any beer, although he had plenty of it, as we could see. We did not much relieve our feelings by suggesting that if the fighting troops were as finicky about their working hours as Navy, Army, and Air Force Institute's employees, we would not have begun a battle, let alone won it. I should like to have shot him. So although we returned to the unit fully laden, we had not been able to buy so much as a stick of chocolate from the Expeditionary Force Institutes, which are popularly supposed to supply the fighting troops. We arrived back to find that all the hopes and promises had been dispelled. The brigade was preparing to move forward, up to Benghazi, beyond which the armored cars were still harrying the enemy's rearguards. Divisional headquarters was already on its way back to the Cairo area. We were to become part of the famous 7th Armored Division, whose sign, the Desert Rat, was to appear on the mudguards of our vehicles. The tanks were to move by transporter, and another party was to go separately by road under the colonel. That concludes the 5th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.